A very warm welcome to my wonderful guest this afternoon, Mr. Carl Niehaus. How are you doing, sir?
Thank you so much for having me. I thought you were going to introduce me as Fighter Niehaus.
Yes. No, thank you for joining us. Our last talk was last year, and we did it over Zoom, and it gained great traction on the internet as well, because you always speak truth to power. And I hope today we can learn a lot from you as well.
Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed that previous interview that we have, which was a virtual platform interview.
Yes.
And during the interview, you said to me, no, you must come to Cape Town.
Yes.
And I then said, well, we'll see when the opportunity arises. So now that I'm here in Cape Town as a member of the EFF in the National Assembly,
yes,
of course, it is possible to come here to your studios. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy that we can have this face-to-face discussion.
Yes.
Because, Zoom and virtual platforms are helpful,
yes,
but they never have the same personal contact that a direct personal interview has.
Exactly. No, thank you very much for coming. I want to talk about the Government of National Unity. Both of them. The one in 1994 that you served in, and this one that we have right now. You served in Nelson Mandela's National Government of National Unity, firstly as an MP. I think you chaired a portfolio in correctional service, and then later on you went to become an ambassador in Netherlands, right? But in that government, you had the African National Congress, the National Party, and also the IFP. But the African National Congress had the majority of 62%. Then you had the National Party with 20% and the IFP. What informed that decision for the African National Congress to form a coalition while having the majority? Can you tell us about the concession? What informed that Government of National Unity in 1994?
Well, let us first technically get it right. In terms of the executive, I was not a member of President Nelson Mandela's Government of National Unity.
Yes.
I was a member of the legislature in the first administration. So, technically speaking, no, I was not officially a member of the Government of National Unity. But, of course, the ANC was the majority party, the true majority party in the Government of National Unity. And in 1994, that was truly a Government of National Unity. Because the majority party, which didn't need, in terms of the vote, to form a Government of National Unity, did so on the basis of agreements that were reached during the negotiations. The CODESA negotiations provided that there will be a Government of National Unity in terms of the interim constitution that was drafted and finally adopted in 1993, and on the basis of which the elections on the 27th of April 1994 then took place. So the provision was that any party that had higher than a certain percentage of the vote during the elections had to be accommodated in terms of the interim constitution in the Government of National Unity.
Being more than 10%.
So it was constitutionally provided for. And it was on the basis of the goodwill of the overall majority party, the African National Congress, that the Government of National Unity in 1994 came about. On that basis, we can say that we truly had a Government of National Unity in 1994. I'm not making now a political and moral judgment on whether the Government of National Unity was a good idea. We thought at the time it was a good idea. As time went on, we saw how the National Party especially exploited that relationship. And then 2 years later President or former President de Klerk, who was then the deputy president, second deputy president in the government of national unity, withdrew the National Party from the government of national unity.
So this is after 2 years?
That was after 2 years.
Okay.
But what we must understand is that good as the intentions were of the government of national unity in 1994, it did not succeed. And the reason why it did not succeed is because it was built on drift sand. It was built on the wrong assumption that it was truly a government where everyone in that government was concerned about advancing the rights of especially the majority of Black and African people. Evidently, the second largest party in that government of national unity, which was then still the old Nationalist Party, were not interested in that. They were there to try and protect the privileges and the benefits that the minority of the white community accrued during the years of apartheid. And they continued to utilize that government of national unity for that purpose.
Okay.
We also have to say that the negotiations at CODESA that led to the interim constitution that gave birth to the government of national unity, and eventually then later the final constitution as it was drafted in the Constitutional Assembly under the chairpersonship of Cyril Ramaphosa. Okay. And I need to state that deliberately because the role of Ramaphosa was a very dubious one, but we will return to that.
Okay.
During that constitution that had been drafted, we saw various interventions from the international community, from imperialist nations.
Contributing to the document.
Contributing, writing draft documents, making particular clauses for the constitution, and making sure that this constitution was going to be a new liberal product, which was in the first instance premised on the understanding that while there is going to be universal franchise, there will not be a change in the economic balances of power in South Africa, that the old economic exploitative relationships that existed under apartheid was going to be continued. So that is why I'm saying that the government of national unity was a failure, because it was based on these wrong intentions and premises of the negotiating process and what eventually resulted in the interim and the final constitution. And we've seen in the last 30 years, even after the original government of national unity collapsed, how this constitution has not served the interests of the majority of Black and especially African South Africans, and how we continue to get a strengthening, in fact, a cementing in of new liberal economic policies that meant that the majority of South Africans actually, relatively speaking, in our society became poorer, that we ended up with the most unequal society in the world, with some of the highest unemployment rates, especially amongst young people, one of the most violent societies, and a society that could not, because of the provisions in the Constitution, provide for the return of the land to the people, expropriation of land without compensation, which is a critical, foundational issue if you want to get fundamental economic transformation in any society, especially one such as ours, where the land was violently, at gunpoint, stolen from the indigenous people.
Can I ask you, Mr. Niehaus, the concession for the government of national unity, did it come from the ANC side or the SACP? Because it is a global phenomenon, whether it's a war-torn country, when there is a government that is developed, it's always about the government of national unity, so that there is gradual gradual change also in government and also, in other aspects of the country. So did that concession come from the African National Congress side, or did it come from another party in the CODESA negotiation?
Look, it came over a long period of time.
A long period of time.
Because remember, the negotiations in CODESA were preceded by pre-negotiations, while the ANC was still in exile. If you look at some of the discussions that took place between the white monopoly capitalist captains of industry and the ANC, dating back to 1985 in Lusaka, where there were agreements made between the delegation of the ANC and those white monopoly capitalist captains of industry who were led by the then CEO of Anglo-American, and they agreed that the economic fundamentals in South Africa will not change. There will be universal franchise, but the economy will continue to function along the same capitalist lines. Subsequently to that meeting, there were many meetings by the ANC leadership, specifically people like Thabo Mbeki, Aziz Pad, Esopad, and others, with representatives of the South African government and with representatives of the South African National Intelligence Service.
Yeah.
Amongst those meetings, which were very important, were meetings in London, in Geneva, and other parts of Europe, with a representative of the South African White Nationalist Party establishment and NIS, Professor Willie Estruyse, who was also a professor of economics and political philosophy at the University of Stellenbosch. And Professor Estruyse continued to push the line that there has to be an accommodation of also the white community in South Africa. And he sold the idea to Thabo Mbeki and the other negotiators in those pre-negotiations of the ANC that without accommodation of the white community and specifically the Afrikaner community, there will not be stability and peace in South Africa. So what I'm saying is by the time we reach the point to take decisions about the need for a government of national unity during the CODESA negotiations, there was a lot of pre-discussion and negotiation going on that already convinced the ANC to go the route of a government of national unity. So yes, of course, the ANC as the majority party could have refused to have a government of national unity. It had the power of the majority vote to do so. But it was already worked on, convinced, cajoled over a long period of time. So when the issue came up, the ANC agreed to a government of national unity.
But didn't that open the gates in 1985? Because most companies sanctioned South Africa. You saw even the Rubicon speech. So didn't that open the gates when the private sector of South Africa started to communicate with the liberation movement? Don't you think that also opened up the gates for what we have today?
Of course it had opened the gates. It made it more palatable for de Klerk when he took over from P.W. Botha as the leader of the National Party and the then president of apartheid South Africa to unban the ANC, the SACP and other liberation movements.
Yes.
So, but it more so opened the gates to the continuing oppression and exploitation of the majority of black South Africans. And for me, that is the fundamental compromise and the unpalatable, betrayed compromise that had been made during those negotiations. It wasn't immediately evident for the average South African that this was the case. Average South African was hopeful that South Africa, now after the 1994 27th of April elections, would become a democracy, that we would be able to start addressing the needs of the majority of black South Africans. What average South Africans did not appreciate is how strong the agreements between the elite in the African National Congress and the white elite and imperialist powers throughout the world had been in order to keep the capitalist system and the status quo in place. And you know, if we think about what the longest serving president of the ANC, Comrade Oliver Reginald Tambo, said in his many broadcasts on Radio Freedom, he always said economic liberation and liberation from racism goes hand in hand. It dovetails. You cannot have liberation from racism without economic liberation, because the economic oppression shadows, mirrors the racist oppression. That's why we had in the past to talk about white monopoly capitalism, and why, because those fundamental relations have not been changed by the negotiations and by 30 years of ANC rule, we still today have to talk about white monopoly capitalism. Those people who try and challenge those of us who insist that white monopoly capitalism is still in control of the economy of South Africa are holding on to fallacious grass halms. They are not interpreting the reality of the South African economy. How can you have, after 30 years, an economy where over 90% of the shares on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange is still under the control of white capitalists? How can you have an economy where 76%, and that is a conservative calculation, it's probably even higher, but 76% of the land is still in the hands of white ownership? That is not a transformed economy.
You still have indirect ownership, though, with black people through their pension funds in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. But I want to ask you a question.
Let's deal with that, because I'm always interested in how the pension fund and specifically the PIC get used as an argument that supposedly the majority of black people have a say in our economy. The PIC has consistently been used and abused to support and fund financial deals and empowerment that eventually leads to the empowerment of white monopoly companies. So the sad situation that you have is, while the PIC is a very important and powerful economic instrument that can be used for black empowerment, it has been subverted and used for the empowerment of white monopoly capitalist groupings. Someone like Brian Molefe, who tried to change the role of the PIC. I remember during the time when he was the CEO of the PIC challenging Barlow World and Barlow Rand about the racist character of their board, and the kind of statements that were made by members of the board, the white members, among them Warren Klilo, who was then the CEO of Barlow World. He was eventually pushed aside, away from that position as chair of the PIC, because the PIC, instead of becoming an instrument of empowerment, became a facilitator of the continuing exploitation of black people, but cynically with black people's money. And that is the tragedy.
But are our workers conscientized to understand there is a stipend that is deducted on a monthly basis that goes to a ShopRite, that goes to a Barlow, that goes to the existing private companies that are there, in holding the PIC into account? Because obviously, if you could look at the JSE indirectly, black workers do own shares through obviously something that is controlled.
But the operative word that you use is indirectly.
Yes.
And I would immediately agree with you, because your question assumes that black workers are not conscientized. They are not. And we need to also be very upset with our trade union movement. COSATU, some of the various trade unions who have benefited from funding of the PIC, who have also used funding that have been contributed by the workers to their own pension funds, to their own investment companies, and used those for purposes that did not empower the majority of black people, but empowered a small group of leaders within those trade unions.
The elites.
Let's go and look at one example.
This is a great conversation.
And that example is eNCA.
Okay.
eNCA was set up with union workers' money. Johnny Copeland, and together with Marcel Golding, they financially mainly financed the purchase of eNCA through union money.
Through union money.
And what happened? The eNCA was never turned into an instrument of advancement of the interests of the majority of black South Africans. In fact, today, of the free news channels that we have, eNCA is probably the most reactionary, conservative, pro-new liberal broadcasting news channel that we have in South Africa, to the point where we in the economic freedom fighters eventually had to say, we are no longer going to participate in inviting you to our press conferences and going to your shows, because we cannot get a proper and fair hearing in any interview that we have with you. I personally have been told by more junior journalists of eNCA that the news editor of eNCA had put me on a blacklist. They cannot interview me. Now, it's not about myself here. It is about the fact that eNCA is a good example of how the money of workers had been abused and became actually a tool of oppression and disempowerment against them.
It's an interesting thing that you mentioned, Mr. Niehaus, because trade unionists are now investment companies, right? Because all that money that's coming in, they're investing in existing companies. I know NUMSA as well. I think they own Dove and some other companies as well. So it's quite an interesting model.
You see, the model, if it is managed in a proper way, can lead to empowerment. But then you must work for black economic empowerment. You cannot use the money of the workers through those investment companies to make sweetheart deals with white monopoly capitalist companies. And what happens is that the leadership of those trade unions and those who are in charge of those investment funds uses those funds not for the advancement of the workers,
but for their
personal advancement, to get themselves onto the boards and onto the executive positions of those big companies that they invest in. And eventually what happens, as it happened in the case of Johnny Copeland and Marcel Golding, they then accumulate those shares not for the company, but for their own personal benefit. And they, as individuals, rather than the trade union investment company, become the majority shareholders in those companies. So they cynically abuse the funds that become available through a trade union investment company for their own self-empowerment, not for black economic empowerment.
It's an interesting one. And obviously, our president also started NUMSA as well. I want to talk about...
Well, our president is a prime example of exactly how this thing works.
Yes, because he was also a trade unionist.
It's through the funds that he managed to accumulate in his private companies.
James Motlatsi
played a central role.
They're tycoons today.
The way in which he actually destroyed businesses of some entrepreneurs in the black community. Who was that gentleman who ran a series of bakeries?
Yes, bakeries, the one in the Northwest.
Yes.
I forgot his name.
He was destroyed. His company was eventually liquidated. But the one person who benefited from that whole disaster was Cyril Ramaphosa. And Shanduka then arose out of
that.
All of this disaster and personal financial empowerment, which started with money from the trade union movement.
Mr. Niehaus, there's a video, right? A video that I've been watching in around 1992 in the Bisho massacre, where you were covering your Secretary General with Robert McBride when OPA Brigadier Qozo's security officers was opening up.
The details are not entirely right. Sorry to interrupt you.
All right.
It wasn't at Bisho. It was actually on the East Rand. When we were visiting on the 3rd of, I know it so well, on the 3rd of January
I thought this was in Bisho.
No, it was 3rd of January 1993 that we were going to hostels on the East Rand.
Oh, it was in the East Rand?
Yes, but the rest of the details that you described, it's correct. We were there to go and look at areas that our self-defense units said were actually now secure. I was there together with Cyril Ramaphosa, who was then the Secretary General of the ANC, together with Joe Slovo. And Robert McBride was in charge of that area of the self-defense units, is also part of that group. You can actually see him walking with us.
Yes, I see.
And you can overhear him in the video saying, things are safe here now. And ironically, just as he said the word safe, from the hostel, the automatic gunfire started. And then the description that you gave now happened.
Yeah.
Ramaphosa, being a civilian, not being a soldier, froze. And he stood straight up. And you can see on the video how I come together with some other members of the protection unit and of Mkonto, and I actually tackle him from the back and pull him down.
And you pulled him down.
And push him then behind a wall. Because when you're in a situation like that, when you're under attack, as a soldier, the first thing you know, you go to the ground. Because you don't stand up, because that makes you a very visible target to be hit. So yes, I did instinctively what my training told me to do. And I protected Ramaphosa. I somewhat tongue in the cheek once said, perhaps I should never have done it. A lot of the trouble that we have now would have passed us if I had not done so. But anyhow, I'm saying it tongue in the cheek. Because no one wishes anyone else to be hit by a bullet or to be killed. Not at all. And I'm not saying that.
But it showed how close...
Yes, that is the background. I've been, as you know, involved in the liberation struggle and in Mkonto Wesizwe for many years.
But I'm sure you guys were very close because you were the spokesperson and he was the Secretary General as well. How was your working relationship and how did your relationship sour? Because you can see from the video, you know, you protecting him.
I was protecting him as a soldier, not because I had any high regard for him. When I worked in the ANC with Ramaphosa, I saw right from the beginning that we're dealing here with someone who doesn't understand the history of the ANC. In fact, someone who's a Johnny-come-lately in the African National Congress and who had been parachuted in by the interests of white monopoly capitalism, the Menels and the Oppenheimers, who pushed President Mandela and who convinced him that Ramaphosa should be brought in as the Secretary General of the ANC. So I was a disciplined member of the ANC. I had to acknowledge the position of Ramaphosa as Secretary General. As national spokesperson of the ANC at that stage, I had to work with him. But I never respected him. I never thought of him truly as a fellow comrade. I saw too much how Ramaphosa was always interested in his own self-advancement. I watched him during the negotiations, always on the side engaging with members of white monopoly capitalism, always trying to make deals for himself, also for the future. I've been on many occasions traveling with him to meetings where behind the scenes, the negotiations of CODESA were concluded between the National Party and the ANC at various game farms.
Yes, in game farms.
I've heard him on the phone making deals with the likes of Rupert, the Ackermans, the Oppenheimers, sitting in the back of the bus, not considering the negotiations and how he can advance the best deal for the people of South Africa, but how he could actually advance for himself the best deal. I watched all of that happening. I watched the close relationship between himself and Rolf Meyer, which in my view was an insidious relationship. It was an unhealthy relationship between the lead negotiator of the apartheid racist National Party and Ramaphosa. They would, in a cozy way, make secret deals and then come and present it to the plenary sessions of CODESA. And because there was this strange concept of sufficient consensus in CODESA, any deal that had been reached between the ANC and the National Party was considered, because these were the two big bulls, so to speak, in the crowd, were considered to represent sufficient consensus.
So it would be
So they make secret deals, they manipulate them into the agenda of CODESA, they present them, they claim that there is sufficient consensus, and it goes through. And that is how Ramaphosa operated. And he was very well rewarded, handsomely rewarded for doing so. I always say when I first met Cyril, he was driving a Volkswagen Golf.
When you met
him? At the end of the negotiations, after he had been the lead negotiator of the ANC, he found himself in the back of the largest 7 Series BMW. I'm using this as an example, of course, of much bigger advancement, because it wasn't just about the 7 Series BMW. It was about the million, and as it now turned out, billions of rands deals that he managed to secure on the back of his sellout negotiations, where he sold the rights, the future, the full political and economic empowerment of the majority of South Africans for his own self-advancement and the self-advancement of a small coterie of people like him, like Mohammed Vali Musa and others who also became major business people, Saki Matkozoma, Mos Mogasheng, I can continue to mention them. They all became major benefactors of that sell-out process that played itself out at CODESA, and of which they, as individuals and as comprador capitalists, were the main benefactors of.
But don't you think Cyril Ramaphosa at the time in that conference, he was popular coming from the unions, and he even beat Alfred Nzo? I mean, Jacob Zuma became also his deputy secretary general. So don't you think that inside he had some popularity? That's why he even won. Look, wouldn't you say that, Mr. Niehaus?
Sincerely,
because it's the delegates who are going to vote.
I sincerely challenge that view of Ramaphosa having been such a popular leader. Ramaphosa was the leader of a sweetheart union, National Union of Mine Workers, that was set up together in a cozy relationship with Anglo-American and with Harry Oppenheimer and Angloval and the Menels of Angloval. The first offices that the NUM got was from Anglo-American. Ramaphosa, even before he became the leader, the Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers, was brought onto the Urban Foundation by the Menels and by the Oppenheimers. And the wife of Clive Menell, and the Menells were the owners of the second largest mining company in South Africa, Anglo-Val. The wife of Clive Menell, Irene Menell, said, "We brought Cyril Ramaphosa onto the Urban Foundation as an insurance policy for us in the future, that he will protect our rights and the position of whites." She said so. She's on record to have said so. Now, the Menells especially were very involved in the personal lives of President Nelson Mandela.
Okay.
During the time that President Mandela was in prison, the Menells took care of President Mandela's two children, Zinzi and Zenani.
Paying for their school fees.
They paid for their school fees. They helped them to go to a very exclusive private school in Swaziland. They arranged all the travel and documents that was necessary. None of these things would have been possible under apartheid South Africa if it wasn't for the intervention of the Menells.
Awesome. Okay.
And you can go to the documentation that is in the Nelson Mandela Center of Memory at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, where you can read those letters that President Mandela wrote from prison to Irene Menell, thanking her
them
for taking care of his children. Now, it's very human, understandable. I don't think we can just condemn President Mandela for that. His kids had to be taken care of.
Yes.
But the intention of the Menells were clearly far more than that. Their intention was to ingratiate themselves to the person that they correctly saw was going to become the next president of South Africa. And then, when President Mandela came out of prison, there was a whole program to ingratiate Cyril Ramaphosa to President Mandela. He was pushed into the Mandela Welcoming Committee.
Okay.
He was the leader, or one of the leaders, together with Murphy Murobe and Pravin Gordhan and others.
Yes.
All of them people who are the acolytes of Cyril Ramaphosa, who were the ones who would go to Victor Verster to meet with President Nelson Mandela. Who was the person who walked right behind President Mandela as he left the gates of Victor Verster? It was Cyril Ramaphosa.
Yeah.
Who was the person on the balcony here at the Cape Town City Hall, there at the parade when President Mandela was doing his first speech, who came and held the mic for him?
Holding the mic.
It was Cyril Ramaphosa. He was inserted into the national consciousness. He was also inserted into the awareness of President Nelson Mandela. And by the time that the first legal national conference of the ANC in June 1991 was to take place in Westpool in Durban, President Mandela was already for a period pushing for Ramaphosa to become the Secretary General. He was told that it would be a good idea to bring someone from the so-called internals rather than the exiles.
Or rather than the exiles.
To be the Secretary General.
Okay.
And of course, Ramaphosa, through NUM and through his involvement with all the cabal people such as Pravin Gordhan, Murphy Murobe, etc., was part of the United Democratic Front.
Yes.
So the idea was the ANC now needs an internal, someone which is part of the United Democratic Front to become the Secretary General.
Okay.
So President Mandela and a number of his associates campaigned strongly before the conference for Cyril Ramaphosa to become the Secretary General, and campaigned for the exile. And that was now the former Secretary General of the ANC, Alfred Nzo, not to be elected. Now, there is no way in 1991 that the will of Nelson Mandela, with his stature, with the incredible backing that he had locally, nationally, and internationally, could be overruled by a conference of the ANC. Mandela was the center.
He was
unassailable. So his support for Cyril Ramaphosa brought Cyril Ramaphosa into that conference as, I repeat again, a Johnny-come-lately, because he was not part of the structures of the ANC. And Ramaphosa certainly was never part of the armed struggle of the ANC, was never a member of Umkhonto we Sizwe. And I always tell this story because I think it is very revealing of the situation we were faced with at that conference.
At the conference.
The then president of the ANC, remember, President Oliver Tambo only stepped down at that conference and then became the national chair, and President Mandela, who up to that conference was the deputy president of the ANC, then was...
And he had a stroke at that time.
Yes, was elected as president.
Yeah.
He was unanimously elected as President Mandela. But Oliver Tambo had 2 strokes while he was in the latter part of his time in exile. But he still was very much the person with the long historical memory of who are the real people who played a role in the liberation struggle. And he sat there on the stage, and Cyril Ramaphosa came in, now on this popular wave, supported by Nelson Mandela on the back of, on the shoulders of some of the people. And Tambo sat, and he very slowly pointed with his finger, and he said, "Ubani lo?" Who is that?
Yeah.
And you see, that is the critical question. Who is Cyril Ramaphosa really? It was not so much a question that Tambo may not have known at all the face of Ramaphosa. But the question was, who is that? What is his intention? Why is he coming in here in the way that he's coming in?
He's coming in.
What is his mission? And that is the question that arises today for us again. What is the mission of this man, Cyril Ramaphosa? Was his mission not always to destroy the ANC as a national liberation movement? Was his mission not exactly what Irene Menel said, to be that guarantor, that insurance policy for white monopoly capitalism, and to be one of the main benefactors of white monopoly capitalism? And that brings us to the link between the Government of National Unity in 1994, which was truly a government of national unity. It fits the definition of what a government of national unity is. And this farcical thing that Ramaphosa today tries to pawn off to us as a government of national unity.
It's not.
Because it is not. First of all, the ANC has lost its power. The ANC is a minority party. It is not the overall majority party. So the ANC did not have the support of the vote of the overall majority of South Africans through its greatness of heart, so to speak, to invite other parties to join a government of national unity. The ANC is forced to form a coalition with other political parties if they still wanted to stay in power.
To form a government.
And that is the reality. And that is why you can never talk about a government of national unity. This is an act of self-preservation by Ramaphosa and the leaders around him. It is an act of desperation. It is a grand coalition that they now formed with a white supremacist, racist political party, the Democratic Alliance, and a reactionary party, the Inkatha Freedom Party, that had always been in the pockets of the Oppenheimers. And this was the mission of Cyril Ramaphosa, to bring us to the point where the ANC as a national liberation movement can no longer be in control of this country. And in the process, he destroyed and hollowed the ANC out to the point where the ANC had actually now become the antithesis of what a liberation movement is. And he's brought us to the point today where he can have all the excuses why none of the true liberation ideals can be implemented by this government of national unity, because the coalition agreement, that dreadful coalition agreement, that he and that analphabet, that man who doesn't seem to be able to read and understand what he reads, Fikile Mbalula, has gone and signed. Now we are in a grand coalition of sellouts. And that is how we need to understand it. And that is why, to try and build a bridge, as Ramaphosa farcical is trying to do by propaganda, between the original government of national unity and this farcical non-government of national unity, which is just a sellout coalition, can never sustain itself.
But Mr. Niehaus, I'd like to ask you, right? Every struggle needs to be funded. It needs some cash, some capital to operate, right? When you came out of prison in 1990, the ANC had to give you a salary, right? Where was that money coming from? It was coming from private backers and so on, right? But don't you think that with what you're saying on how private infiltrated the ANC, right? It was inevitable, because private will always want to win the day. They will try to sort of co-opt some of the leaders and give them shares and largesses so that they can also influence policymakers. But wouldn't you say that is any party has to be funded by someone? It's very difficult to scale an organization without funds.
Of course, every party has to be funded.
Yes.
But don't come and try and make up excuses for the ANC. No. Just hear me out.
Okay, yes.
The ANC may have been financially not in a very good position when it re-entered South Africa after it was in exile.
Yes.
But it did have some resources from progressive nations and from support of the anti-apartheid progressive movements in the world.
Okay.
It also won 64% of the vote in the first 27th of April 1994 election. You want to tell me, if you had the real disciplined intention to leverage from that position of power and to work to build for yourself proper investments, to work for yourself on the basis of black economic empowerment, real investment and returns in terms of donations from black economically empowered South Africans, that you could not build for yourself an economic base, a financial base, that was not going to be dependent on white monopoly capitalism. It could have been done.
It could have been.
The
there
issue
was an
is
alternative,
it was not done because they did not want to do it, because there were certain leaders within the ANC who allowed themselves already to be compromised in exile, and who already saw for themselves a route to get as much personal financial empowerment through shareholdings, through shadowing and fronting for white monopoly capitalist companies, that they squandered that opportunity to build an independent financial base for the African National Congress that could have funded the ANC, together, of course, with support from progressive nations in the world, such as China, such as Russia, such as Turkey, and many other nations, which
the
I'm
Nordic
sure
countries as well
would have been prepared. African countries would have been prepared to support a progressive program for the ANC. But they allowed themselves deliberately because they wanted to enrich themselves, to become entangled into a situation where they are now totally, entirely dependent on white monopoly capitalist money. Don't you think it is disgraceful that one has to hear that just as the 2017 National Conference, the 54th National Conference of the ANC was unfolding, and it became clear to the white monopoly capitalists that apparently Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was likely to win that contestation, that Stephen Koshev, the then CEO of Investec, put a fund together. A fund which eventually counted up to R1 billion in order to avoid Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma from being elected as president of the ANC and to bribe Cyril Ramaphosa through all those CR70 funds and bank accounts into the presidency. A fund which was specifically set up to bribe Didi Mabuza at the last minute to swing his vote away from Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma to Cyril Ramaphosa. Disgraceful. And Didi Mabuza is one of the prime examples of disgraceful behavior, of someone who sold his soul to money while he could have played a major role in the liberation of the majority of black and African people. But for him, it was more important to get a lot of dollars. I don't know where he hid them. Perhaps he hid them also in the couch, such as his later boss, Cyril Ramaphosa. But to do that, to sell your soul, to abuse the vote and the support that your branches had given to you to go and work for radical economic transformation is utterly disgusting and unforgivable. I once bumped into Didi Mabuza. I hesitated for a moment because I almost said comrade, and I don't call the man comrade anymore.
Is it?
I once bumped into him, and I said to him, Didi, tell me, how do you sleep at night? And he looked at me and said, what do you mean? I said, and the more important question, in the morning when you get up and you look into that mirror, how do you look into that sellout face of yours?
Told it right.
I have had enough of that man. He is an abuser. I watched him even in the run-up to the 55th National Conference, when he was now the deputy president because of the sellout, literal sellout arrangement that he made with Stephen Koshev and others. When he was, in terms of the positions that he held, also the chairperson of the Presidential Task Team for Military Veterans.
Okay.
He then called members of Umkhonto weSizwe Military Veterans Association to his official residence, OR Tambo House in Pretoria. And as we were meeting there, he said, look, guys, I know that you in MKMVA are under attack and the president wants you to be disbanded, etc., etc. But I'm going to need your support.
Yes.
To get myself elected into the 55th National Conference as president.
Oh, okay.
How much money do you need?
Wow. And there was silence.
And I won't mention who the other members of MVA's executive were. They must speak for themselves.
Okay.
But I said to Mabuza, can we please go to the kitchen?
Okay.
And as we got to the kitchen, and he was together with this other sellout who's also part of the government, who was previously the Minister of Intelligence. And I said to him, Didi, I can't say the exact words. Go and F yourself. He said, how can you say that? I said, Didi, get out of my face. I'm leaving now. And I didn't even go back into the lounge. I left from the back door of the kitchen to my car and I left. Because this is how this man operates. He bribes. He comes to people and compromise them. He gets information about people and then try to manipulate them to do things for him. Even a couple of years before that incident, myself and a very close comrade of myself, Comrade Nkosazana Shezi, were in Durban at a rally for workers on May Day.
Yes.
And Didi then, as the deputy president, came to Durban. And he was sitting on the stage there and he saw me and Nkosazana there at the VIP side. And he called me. He sent one of his sidekicks to bring me onto the stage. He said to me, come and sit here next to me. He said, why are you so supportive of President Zuma? He said, that man's time is over. Come to my hotel room. I've got a bag of money there. We can share it. And then you stop your nonsense of supporting Zuma. And I dare Didi Mabuza to counter me on this. Because I've got a witness that Nkosazana Shezi was offered the same deal. Then I told him to go to hell. And then, as I said, a couple of years later, there in his house at OR Tambo, in the kitchen, I told him once again, he can go to hell. But I go into detail about this. Not so much because one wants to do personal attacks on individuals, but to use it as an example of the kind of people that the ANC had become infiltrated to, and the kind of people who are now the leadership of the ANC. Mabuza is just an example of what Ramaphosa is, what Paul Mashatile is, what Fikile Mbalula is, what Gwede Mantashe is, the whole shebang. They all have lost any idea of any ideology. They are not driven by any conviction to improve the lives of the people of this country. They are only driven by self-interest and by money. There is no ideology. They are the personification of the death of ideology.
I want to talk about the faction, the RET faction within the ANC, right? You were very supportive of Jacob Zuma. Personally, yourself, you were very close with him. When he appeared in court, you were by his side. You were a friend in a beat. But did Jacob Zuma tell you his intention of starting a political party? Because I even remember the time when you were the spokesperson of the MKMVA and you were there, you were supporting him and so on. But did he really open up to you that, look, the intention is we will open up a political party?
Yes. President Zuma told me long in advance that he was forming the MK party. Okay. In fact, I was aware...
At the time you were in MKMVA at the time?
I was aware... when the MK party was first registered,
yes,
by
Jabulani
Khumalo, President Zuma took me into his confidence, so I knew what he was planning.
Okay.
So the idea that I decided to join the Economic Freedom Fighters because I did not know that MK party was to be formed is not true.
Okay.
It is a total fallacious idea. I knew exactly. I took a very deliberate decision that I was not going to join MK Party, but that I was going to join the Economic Freedom Fighters.
Okay.
You will remember that after I resigned from the ANC in December 2022, I then, in February 2023, formed an organization with the name of the African Radical Economic Transformation Alliance.
ARETA.
And ARETA had a set of radical economic transformation ideals as set out in our founding documents. But if you go back to the press conference that I held on the 26th of February 2023, when ARETA was formed, I said, we need to work for unity. That ARETA is there as an instrument for the advancement of radical economic transformation. But it has no right to exist just for its own existence. We must work for unity. And if the time comes for ARETA to stop to exist for the sake of unity, that time will arrive and we will make the necessary announcements. Go and read the statement we made there. So during the year of 2023, I consistently engaged with all progressive political parties and leaders, the Economic Freedom Fighters, the African Transformation Movement, the Pan-Africanist Congress, UDM. Some of them don't sound so very progressive now because they've gone and joined this farcical government of national unity. PAC and UDM
PAC as well.
Deeply disappointed me. But I talked to all of them. And I remember in September 2023, I gathered with all of these parties around a table at the house of President Zuma in Forest Town. And we were talking about unity. And I asked all of those leaders who were present there a question. I said, please tell me, are any of you around here against expropriation of land without compensation? They said, no, we all agree. Said, are any of you against the nationalization of the South African Reserve Bank and the fact that our state-owned enterprises need to remain in government control and need to be strengthened as government institutions, that we need to go through a process of the creation of a state bank, etc., etc. Those basic tenets of radical economic transformation. And they all said, no, we all agree about it. I said, guys, sadly, I had to say guys because there were only men there. That's another thing that we need to correct. We need to get women leadership. But that just as an aside. I said, guys, but why are there then so many political parties around this table? Why can't we unite as one? I said, my concern is that it has got nothing to do with ideology, but it's got everything to do with your egos. Each one of you want to be a leader of your own little party.
So that's why
in Afrikaans, there's a saying, koning op jou eie miskoek. King on your own dumb.
That's a good one.
I said, all of you want to see your posters on the lampposts, but you're not thinking about how we can unite to create the strongest progressive force in South Africa. So when I left that meeting, the next meeting of the executive of ARETA, I said to my executive, after what I said in that meeting, I can no longer justify to continue with the individual existence, separate existence of ARETA. ARETA has to be integrated. And us as individual members of ARETA have to be integrated into another progressive political party. And I said to them, I'm giving you homework. Go away for a week. Consider which of the left progressive political parties in South Africa we should join. But our existence on the basis of my own self-criticism cannot be justified. So after a week we came back, they all said to me, the economic freedom fighters. And I had to smile and say, yes, that was my conclusion too. But I didn't want to impose my conclusion onto the executive of ARETA. So on that basis, we decided that we will join as individual members, not as ARETA, but as individual members the economic freedom fighters, because when you join another well-established, strong political party such as the EFF, you have to be humble.
Yes.
I couldn't come and compare Areta with the EFF. Areta was a small outfit. The best thing to do was to join as individuals. And come and give our support to the economic freedom fighters and integrate ourselves organizationally within the branches, the region, the province of the EFF. And that is exactly what we did. Now, when I made that decision, as I've said to you, I knew very well that President Zuma was planning now to launch on the 16th of December 2023.
So you knew
the MK party.
The MK party.
But I announced on the 14th of December, the 14th of December, 2023, that Areta is being disbanded and that we will join individually as members of Areta, the economic freedom fighters. I informed President Zuma. I sat down with him. We had a long conversation. I said, Baba.
In Kandla?
No, the meeting actually took place in Johannesburg at his daughter's house. I said to him, Baba, I'm not going to join MK. My reasons are that I don't believe we should create more parties. We should create less. We should unite. We shouldn't divide further. I also think that it would be better for you to come out in support of the economic freedom fighters. Even if you're not ready to join the EFF as a member, my advice to you is to make a call that all progressive forces, including your very huge support base, should support the EFF in the upcoming elections of 2024. President Zuma decided otherwise. He decided to proceed with the formation of the MK party. There's no bad blood between me and him. I've got the right to take my decisions. He had the right to take his decisions. But I still maintain up to this day that we would have done better if we were united. I still maintain what my president and commander-in-chief, President Julius Malema, said in the first press conference that he addressed in February 2024 after the formation of the MK party. He was addressing a press conference at Moses Mabhida Stadium just before we had our National Elections Manifesto launched there. He said, the ideal situation would have been if President Zuma called on everyone to support the EFF. That would have given us a more united base. But okay, things have turned out as they have turned out. I'm very happy that I've joined EFF. I've not had a moment's regret. I entered a highly ideologically sound political party with strong principles, clearly set out in the 7 non-negotiable pillars of the EFF in the EFF's founding manifesto. I joined a party which had the most detailed and the most progressive 2024 election manifesto, 267 pages of it. I joined a party that has got young, brilliant, progressive leadership. And for me, these are the important issues. I'm a strong believer in ideology. I myself am a Fanonist Marxist. I believe in socialism and the future of communism. I believe that the land is the foundation of all economic restitution and that the land must be expropriated without compensation. I believe that the political party must be well organized. It must have central democracy. It must have discipline. It must have consequence management. All of those things are in abundance available in the economic freedom fighters. And I want to emphasize this. I believe that it is important to grow and nurture young, strong leadership. We cannot continue to work with old leaders. I myself am 64.
Agree.
I am one of the older generation. Whether I like it or not, whether I resisted many of the sellout things that happened in the ANC, I also have to take co-responsibility for the fact that under my watch, some of these terrible sellout things happened, although I resisted them.
Yes.
I said to President Zuma, Baba, I greatly respect you. But you are over 80. We now need to hand the baton over
to the next generation.
And that generation is represented by people like the CIC of the Economic Freedom Fighters, our President Julius Malema, our Deputy President, a brilliant man, Floyd Shivambu, Commissar Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, and many other young leaders. The EFF has got an oversupply of young leaders.
Yes.
And those leaders need to be the future leaders of South Africa. Now, during these elections, the EFF saw a slight decline of its membership. Not membership, but of its support in terms of the vote.
So you're no longer the third largest party, you're the fourth now.
But the point is, no one must think this is a death knell for the EFF. This is simply a temporary setback because of the historical situation that played itself out, because of the divisions that there were in the left, because of the support on the back of deep disaffection, especially in KwaZulu-Natal and other parts of South Africa for MK Party. What we saw is that MK Party got a substantial amount of the vote. What we must do now, and I'm glad that we are beginning to achieve that in Parliament, is we as progressive forces, the Economic Freedom Fighters with our strong ideological base, with our clarity of ideology, our great young leaders, the MK Party with the support that it managed to get in these elections, with the good decision that had been taken by President Zuma to appoint Mr. Justice Hlophe as the parliamentary leader of the MK Party, we must find a way to form a progressive, united caucus, which will work together to advance the ideals for full economic liberation in our lifetime and to become the strongest opposition that we have ever seen in South Africa against the sellout government of national unity. We must now be more effective than ever before as an oversight opposition in the National Assembly and in all the various provincial legislatures to bring the feet of these sellouts to the flames and to show up the contradictions, because ultimately our intention must be that this sellout grand coalition must collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Our intention must be to destroy by legal means this sellout government.
Mr. Niehaus, you talk about economic liberation, and obviously I want to take you back as well. After the Anglo-Boer War, right? You're an Afrikaner and all of that. So after the Anglo-Boer War, right? The Afrikaner population was quite impoverished, right?
Yes, very.
Very, very impoverished. But obviously you had the National Party that came in. Firstly, I think it came in around 1928 and then again around 1948, right? So they were establishing state-owned enterprises. I think the number one reason for that was to eradicate the poverty within the Afrikaner community. How can that model be that model hasn't worked currently in empowering black people. How can that model work in today's
the National Party really came into ascendancy in 1948.
I don't know if that question came out right. Yeah.
Came into ascendancy in 48.
Didn't it come in 19... It was in 1928 first. After 1910...
No, you're looking at what was called in 1928 the Herstigte National Party, which was under General Hertzog. Yes. It was not the same National Party that when transformed itself in 1948 on the back of the policy of apartheid. In 1928, Hertzog was primarily in opposition to Jan Smuts, and it was the period where the nationalists within South Africa were trying to take a posture of anti-British imperialism. Those were the main pillars of the 1928 movement. And they did gain some power within government. But the power remained mainly with what was called the old United Party, which was a pro-British imperialist and pro-British Crown Party under Jan Smuts and Jan Hofmeyer. Those were the two main leaders. Then in 1948, having split away, having disagreed with Hertzog, the new National Party, this was now called the Herstigte National Party, under Dr. D.F. Malan emerged. How did they emerge? They emerged on the basis of support for the Afrikaner poor, the Afrikaner working class, with a promise that they were going to uplift the white Afrikaner working class out of poverty. And the commitment that they made was that this was going to be done through state intervention and through state-owned enterprises. This was, if you go and read the manifesto of the National Party in 1948, the main tenets on which they based their manifesto. And then, of course, they said this upliftment has to go hand in hand with an exclusion of the majority of black and African people. We need to create certain exclusive empowerment zones and areas of work for whites where black people will not be able to have those jobs. It was the National Party of 1948 that introduced the concept of work reservation. Job reservation for whites. And then they empowered what was the Suid-Afrikaanse Spoorweë, the old South African railways.
Railways and harbors.
The creation of Eskom. The creation of ISCO under Van der Bijl, which was a big Afrikaner Nationalist Party industrialist. And these companies then introduced the policy of job reservation. I'm sitting in my family as a benefactor of that policy because my parents were working class, lower middle class Afrikaners, very poor. My dad was trained as a fitter and turner in the South African railways.
He was working.
My grandfather, my dad's father, was what they called on the railways a shunter. Someone who was helping to put the trucks together, railway trucks.
The railway trucks.
To put them behind the main locomotive. Very basic menial work. But those jobs, the National Party then reserved for whites. And they started to pay those whites considerably higher salaries than what the black workers were paid. They also provided for them basic support services, social support services, housing. The railway, Suid-Afrikaanse spoorweë built huge estates of railway homes.
Okay.
Just for white Afrikaner railway workers. You can still go to some of the small facebrick, exactly. You can still go to some of the small towns throughout South Africa, and there's a particular area where there's always facebrick houses.
Yes, yes.
Those houses were built by the South African railways for their workers, and all of the workers were allowed to stay there were white. So white, poor, white, lower middle class were uplifted through the intervention of state-owned enterprises. And there is a very interesting book that had been written by the economist Dan O'Mara called Volkskapitalisme, Nation Capitalism, which shows how these state-owned enterprises, through government intervention, uplifted the folk, uplifted the nation.
A nation.
So, the Afrikaners and the National Party knew very, very well how state-owned enterprises have been utilized by them in order to improve the lives on a racist basis of white Afrikaners. And they didn't want the newly elected democratic government of the ANC to have that power. So right from the beginning, they started the process of undermining the power of state-owned enterprises. And they wanted those state-owned enterprises to be privatized. Because remember now, they realized that as long as the state-owned enterprises stay under government control, it will be a black majority government that can have the control over this massively important industrial base and can help to uplift black and especially African people. But by then, already in the 1980s and early 1990s, a number of very wealthy, not just English, but also Afrikaner, white monopoly capitalist business people have emerged. Some of them originally coming from that poor white Afrikaner background, but who have been uplifted by the state-owned enterprises that the National Party advanced, and those people were now the ones with capital in the private sector. So they said, let's remove the power of state-owned enterprises from a black government. Let's go for a privatization model. And let's get these big capitalists that have now emerged in our own circle, in our own ranks, to become the owners on a private basis of these companies, enrich themselves, and they will make sure that these companies will no longer be used for the fundamental transformation of our economy and the building of a black empowered nation in South Africa. And that is exactly what they've done. The big treachery from the side of the ANC is that the ANC bought into this idea of the privatization of state-owned enterprises because it removed the most significant tool from the toolbox, so to speak, that the ANC had for economic transformation and for economic empowerment. And that is the essence of the treachery of someone like Pravin Gordhan, who played a central role in pushing this program of privatization of state-owned enterprises into the hands, literally into the hands of these white monopoly capitalists. And now we are faced, and I must emphasize this because I think it's one of the most dangerous things of this so-called government of national unity. We are faced by the decision of President Ramaphosa to remove a Department of State-Owned Enterprises, of public enterprises, and integrate it into the presidency. Because now he said that the new model that will be developed for the future of state-owned enterprises will be decided in the presidency under his control. And we all know what he wants. This will remove any oversight over what is happening with the transformation of state-owned enterprises into private enterprises by the presidency, because what not many of us know, in Parliament there are oversight committees, portfolio committees, for every department except for the presidency.
Oh, except for the presidency.
So he's now removed any opposition and any oversight on how he's going to run on steroids the privatization program of state-owned enterprises. And there is no oversight in the legislature, in the National Assembly, to call him to order. One of the most critical things that we now, as MK party and especially as the economic freedom fighters have to do, is to insist that there must also come an oversight committee, a portfolio committee, overseeing the functioning of the presidency. And that's one of the issues that we are going to place very firmly on the agenda of the National Assembly.
Mr. Niehaus, don't you think some of the state-owned enterprises, especially the ones that are insolvent, should be partially privatized, bringing in private partners so that they can work with government, instead of having solely owned state-owned enterprises? I mean, we're moving with time, even with the National Party as well. Sasol was partially privatized by the National Party. You had ISCO as well, that was partially privatized, but you still have the state that is there, to also look after its interest. If something is not bringing in profit to the treasury, I don't see this model of keeping something as it is. Don't you think that we should, transform it in some form of a way? Because with the Afrikaner development as well, yes, you mentioned about the state. Let's look at the private side as well. You had also your savings, to fund businesses. You had, after World War II, there weren't that much, Afrikaner multimillionaires, but they grew their enterprises, your Voorbrand, your Distels, and so on.
But all of those, sorry to interrupt you, all of those, in one way or another, find their roots in finances that they got from the state and from state-owned enterprises. Yeah. Now, I am not in principle opposed to a partnership between the private sector and state-owned enterprises. What I am in principle opposed to is the wholesale privatization of state-owned enterprises and a situation where you give away the overall majority control of the shares in those companies to the private sector. Why am I opposed to it? Because when you talk about the issue of profit, you saw me smiling.
Yes.
Because if we simply allow ourselves to be driven by some idea or a particular understanding of profit, as profit on what is the bottom line in a company which is accrued to the shareholders, we don't understand what economic development is all about. Economic development must also be about the empowerment of the people. So, in some instances, you may have certain enterprises that do not show a particular profit, but the contribution of those enterprises to the development of the overall economy and the nation is such that it actually contributes to the overall economic and socio-economic well-being of those nations. Here, let me give you let me give you an example in Europe.
Yeah.
The commuter railway system in countries such as the Netherlands, in France, in Germany, have never been economically viable enterprises. They never registered a single cent of profit. What they do is they play a role in the facilitation of infrastructure, economic development, on which then many other private enterprises grow and develop and become strong. So we need sometimes to have enterprises that will not have as its most important objective the optimization of the bottom line profit, but the optimization of the development of this country, which will then spin off into profitable companies in the private sector. And that is what has been achieved by economies such as the economy in the Netherlands through their railway system and other government subsidized industries. And that is what we need to do also here in South Africa. One of the prime examples of a nation that knows how to do this and where the state plays a major role in the economy is China. China has managed to develop huge infrastructure in cities through government involvement and intervention. And on the back of that, a massive private sector has developed, which has created jobs and wealth for the Chinese people. We need to take those models seriously. There's a similar model playing itself out in Vietnam, very successful. In South Africa, the full-scale privatization of state-owned enterprises simply driven by the profit objective is unacceptable, and it is not there for a developmental economy. It is there for an exploitative, capitalist-driven economy, which will continue to marginalize the majority of South Africans.
With state-owned enterprises, I mean, they ended up being a feeding trough for the politically elite, but you still have these critical, state-owned enterprises that that play a massive role in the economy, like the rails, like the electricity, but it's still solely owned by the state. Don't you think you also need to introduce the private competition for them?
Look, let's start off with the first part of what you've said about state-owned enterprises having become a feeding trough for some of the corrupt elite, especially of the ANC. That's true.
Yes.
But the fact that that is the case cannot be the argument for the privatization or wholesale privatization of state-owned enterprises. What it must be is an argument for a different way of managing those state-owned enterprises to make sure that they are under better and professional management, that they are being run professionally, that the best people for the job are appointed on the basis of merit, that you do not use deployment in a partisan and party political way, but that people with skill and ability run those industries, and that you take very strong action against any form of corruption. So changing all of that is possible without privatizing those state-owned enterprises. And you can go to the elections manifesto of the economic freedom fighters, that 267-page document that I referred to earlier. There is an expansive chapter on how we want to professionalize and improve the management on the basis of merit and on the basis of consequence management of state-owned enterprises. We then go into detail about how different state-owned enterprises have different characteristics, such as Transnet, such as Eskom, and we say these are the ways in which they should be managed to make them effective and service providers for South Africa. I can't go into all those details now. But the principle is that the control of the state on state-owned enterprises must be maintained, but that does not exclude, and this comes back to the second part of the question you've asked me, that does not exclude the possibility of partnerships with the private sector.
Yes.
But never a wholesale privatization of state-owned enterprises, simply a sellout of state-owned enterprises to the private sector. I don't believe that will serve the people of South Africa, because those industries in the private sector, under the current capitalist model that we have in South Africa, will simply be driven by the profit motive and will simply be there for the empowerment and enrichment of the shareholders, and will not be there for the service of the majority of South Africans. And it is through the intervention of the state that continuing service and economic growth for the sake of the upliftment and the development of our people is critical. There are good examples of how in municipalities and in various government institutions you don't need to privatize everything. You don't need to outsource everything. In fact, outsourcing has become one of the worst consequences of exploitation of workers in South Africa. And there are many good examples where insourcing of workers and their services through local government institutions, through municipalities, has improved services, but also has improved the working conditions of those workers, because they're now being placed on a proper employment contractual arrangement which gives them the right to medical aid, to pension, to leave, to all of those things that they don't get when they are simply contract workers on companies to which these services are outsourced in a corrupt way through the whole corrupt tender system. The other thing that the EFF is absolutely committed to is to bring an end to tenders. We do not want to see a continuation of the tender system in South Africa, because tenders is at the root of the corruption of this nation, and also actually at the root of the corrosive destruction of the ANC. Because people started joining the ANC not because they believe in liberation, not because there was any ideological commitment to the transformation of the society.
Yes.
But because of the tender system, the ANC was seen as a conduit for being able to get influence, to get tenders, and to enrich yourself.
So the alternative to that is insourcing and training workers more to do the services internally. Okay, that's a great one. So in Parliament...
And there are good examples of that. Sorry to interrupt.
In the insourcing.
In many of our local government municipalities, where the EFF had an influence.
Okay.
And one of those great examples is what happened at the Metropolitan Municipality of Johannesburg, when the EFF was not in coalition with anyone, but the EFF was engaging with the then mayor of Johannesburg, Herman Mashaba.
Oh, Herman, yes.
And said, look, if you insource security workers, cleaners, etc., we will be prepared on the basis of an arrangement, not a coalition, but an arrangement to support the passing of the budget of the municipality. He did go for insourcing under those circumstances, not because he was ideologically committed to it. In fact, originally he was very strongly opposed to it. And today, if you look at the areas where service delivery is the best in Johannesburg, it is in all those areas where insourcing have taken place. I even had to chuckle to listen to Herman Mashaba during this election, trying to take, to claim the accolades for the insourcing that happened in Johannesburg, while he knows very well that the only reason why he insourced was because of the way in which he was pressured by the economic freedom fighters, and it was set as a condition for the EFF's vote to pass the budget in Johannesburg that insourcing took place. But the success has happened, and of course the old saying is true, there are many fathers to success, but failure is always an orphan.
No, it's quite an interesting one.
Yeah.
So in Parliament, you're serving in which committee?
I'm a permanent member of the Portfolio Committee on Defence and Military Veterans.
And what do you think of the current appointment, the Minister Angie Motshekga, who's appointed as the Minister of Defence, and also you have General Holomisa, who's deputizing her, but I'm not too sure, she doesn't have military experience. Was she an MK combatant? Well,
evidently she doesn't. And she's not really done well as Minister of Basic Education. Basic education has not advanced. Under her control of the Department of Basic Education, we've seen disasters such as the 30% pass rate being introduced. We have seen disasters such as MathLit, which is an absolute aberration and disempowers the majority of students that are allowed to do MathLit while they should do proper mathematics.
Totally.
So Angie Motshekga has a history of failure, but you see, sadly, in the ANC and even more so now in this grand coalition, failure because people are acquiescent, because they are acolytes of Cyril Ramaphosa in the ANC gets rewarded. So we've now got an underperforming minister who has been appointed to the Ministry of Defence and Military Veterans, who has shown no capacity to transform the Department of Basic Education, and she's been given an even more massive and difficult task with the Ministry of Defence, the Department of Defence in deep crisis, with its budgets having been cut over the last number of years, massively so. I was part of a briefing by the Ministry of Defence yesterday to our Portfolio Committee, and they tell us that the shortfall on the budget is 50 billion rands. So this is the crisis. Equipment is deteriorating. The morale of our South African National Defence Force soldiers are rock bottom. People are truly disillusioned with how they get treated in the SANDF. We send troops into Africa for so-called peace missions,
DRC,
such as what has happened in the DRC. Those troops do not have the necessary supply chains. They do not have the necessary equipment. They don't even have the necessary training. They are sent there as sitting ducks to be attacked by very, very effective and well-equipped rebels. That is what happened a couple of weeks ago at the city of Sake, where 22 South African National Defence Force soldiers were severely injured and 2 of them actually died. Now, this is the disaster that Angie Motshekga has to address. I'm very seriously concerned whether she has the capacity to do so. We were told last night that she has a performance agreement with the president, which includes that they will send even more troops, take note, not withdraw our troops, but send more troops into the DRC. And it is evident that those troops go there to defend the super exploitation of the resources of the DRC and the people of the DRC for white monopoly companies which extract those rare minerals that they mine there. So it is a disaster. It is also a disaster in the Department of Military Veterans, where the department has not been able to service the needs of military veterans for the longest period of time. In fact, I'm quite happy to say, objectively speaking, that the Department of Military Veterans is the most underperforming, the worst performing department in all of our already poorly performing government departments. It has not serviced any of the 11 rights that are established in the Military Veterans Act number 18 of 2011 for military veterans. It was since 2011 supposed to pay out pensions to military veterans. It has failed dismally so up to now, 2024. That is 23 years later. This year, they budgeted 331 million rands for pensions. But because of maladministration, because of a lack of proper administration of the military veterans database, they only paid out pensions to 265 people out of the thousands of military veterans that are there. And now we've been told that 265 million rands of that 331 million that had been budgeted will have to be returned to the National Treasury because of underspending. This is criminal. It is a tragedy because the military veterans who need those pensions, who could have benefited from that 256 million that is going to be paid back, are living in dire poverty. I know of fellow military veterans, because I'm also a military veteran. I've been part of Umkhonto, which is where who are unemployed, who go hungry every day, who do not have houses, MK veterans who are living like paupers under bridges. And this is the kind of mismanagement. So the long and the short of it is, I do not have much hope that Minister Motshekga or her deputy will make much of a change. In fact, it may be even worse than before, because they are born out of this illegitimate arrangement that has been made in a so-called government of national unity. And this coalition is not going to address the needs of our people, and evidently also not the needs in terms of our security through the Department of Defense, nor address the legitimate needs of military veterans. So our job in the Portfolio Committee of Defense and Military Veterans is to play a very active oversight role, to also engage with military veterans, to get their concerns and to highlight their concerns and to fight for their rights. I said yesterday in the committee to the representative of the Department of Military Veterans who gave us a briefing.
Who's chairing it?
It is chaired by, now it is elected Dakota Legute, who is a ANC member of parliament. And he was elected as chair on the back again of this farcical arrangement between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance. When that election took place yesterday, we as the economic freedom fighters abstained, because it was a preconceived plan to get him elected. We were just presented with a fait accompli. So we will not participate in farcical elections, but we will effectively participate in the Portfolio Committee. And I see it as my duty to use my experience as a military veteran myself, as someone who has been involved in fighting for the rights of military veterans my whole life, who've been a member of the Umkhonto Sizwe Military Veterans Association when it was still acknowledged by the ANC as the association representing military veterans. I was the national spokesperson of MKMVA. I've got strong links with military veterans throughout the country. And going to fight for their rights I'm not going to allow ourselves to be hoodwinked, and I'm going to take this non-functioning Department of Military Veterans on head on.
The deployment of our troops in the DRC and also in Mozambique as well. What is the main reason? Is it protecting? I know in Mozambique it's protecting against insurgency in Pemba. But is it mainly more protecting the financial interest of South Africa in these regions?
Well, you see, that is on the basis of agreements with SADC.
Okay.
So there is a regional international commitment that the South African government has entered into within the SADC context.
Okay, yes.
But my concern is that if we make commitments like that,
okay,
we first of all have to interrogate what are the intentions of such deployments. Are they truly there to bring an end to armed conflict, the silencing of the guns that the African Union is so strongly proposing and which one must support? Or are they there for the protection and advancement of economic exploitation by big companies such as I have said already in this interview in the DRC that are involved in the most horrible extraction of rare minerals with the help of child labor in the DRC, and then we send troops to protect those companies that are under attack from rebels. I'm not going to comment on the merits or demerits of what the rebels stand for.
Okay.
Secondly, if we do commit ourselves to the deployment of our soldiers in areas of conflict in Africa, surely it is our duty to make sure that our soldiers will be well provisioned, are properly trained, have all the necessary equipment in order first and foremost to protect themselves and then to carry out their duties. None of that is existent in the deployments that we see now. It is clear from all the evidence that we receive that our troops are sent there without the necessary equipment. They are not well trained. They are ill-equipped to carry out the duties that they are given. And they become the sitting ducks for the attacks by the rebels. That terrible mortar attack in Sake showed that our troops were not ready to defend themselves, did not have the equipment to counterattack, and the South African National Defence Force, and specifically President Cyril Ramaphosa, who is ultimately the responsible person as the president for sending the troops there, must account to the families of those troops who have died. And we as Parliament must ask President Ramaphosa about the right that we have given him in the previous Parliament through a declaration on the deployment of those troops. And I believe it would be necessary under the current circumstances to withdraw that approval and to say that our troops must be returned. We cannot allow our people to be sent to these missions to be slaughtered.
Are they under the United Nations peacekeeping? What is the agreement there?
No, they're not under the United Nations peacekeeping. They work under the auspices of SADC. But obviously, I'm sure that there's quite a lot of cooperation with the UN. But for me, that those modalities are not the most important thing. For me, the important thing is that we must be clear about the reasons why we undertake a mission.
All right.
And we cannot be part of a mission that is in essence meant to protect the super exploitation of the people of a country and the super extraction of profit. We cannot be the guardians of the most horrible capitalist exponents that there are in the world, first of all. And secondly, I repeat again, no general and no commander-in-chief such as President Cyril Ramaphosa is of the South African National Defence Force has the right to send his or her troops to be slaughtered. You must always make sure that your troops will be well trained, well equipped, and well protected. And none of these issues are at the moment complied with these missions.
Let's look at also on the geopolitics side. What is your view on the Russian and Ukraine war that's happening? What is your view on that?
I'm a strong supporter.
Yes.
Of the reasons why President Putin decided to carry out the special military operation in the Ukraine.
Okay.
I understand that President Putin was faced with a very serious threat to the national sovereignty of the Russian Federation.
Okay.
And I understand that the encroachment of the West and of NATO on the sovereignty of the Russian Federation was a very serious one that President Putin had to respond to. Now, if the United States of America was in the same situation where the Russian Federation finds itself with the encroachment of NATO into the Ukraine, combined with the uprising of new Nazi forces in the Ukraine.
Okay.
If the United States had such a situation on its borders, I can assure you that the action that they would have taken would have been far more comprehensive than the steps that President Putin had taken. This is a self-protection, preservation operation by President Putin in defense of the integrity of the Russian Federation against imperialism and against NATO encroachment. And in that context, President Putin must be supported. He has taken a correct step that also helps us to move away from this bilateral power arrangements that we see in the world to multilateral power arrangements, where many different nations should emerge as powers that are part of a complex power relationship in the world, which is not dominated by Western imperialism and specifically by the United States of America.
So I can hear you totally against NATO's expansion to the east.
Absolutely.
Right? But what is your solution? Do you think Donbas, the areas that have been occupied by Russia, should be part of the Russian Federation? What is your solution out from this conflict?
Well, I cannot be prescriptive to the people who live in Donbas and other areas. And I think they must be able to bring out their own democratic wishes on how they want to be part of Russia or part of any other nation. I think it is important.
But do you think referendums in wartime is...
No, but I mean, obviously, we are not dealing with a referendum in wartime now. We are dealing with a special military operation that is being carried out by the Russian Federation in defense of its own integrity and in defense of people within the Ukraine that had been seriously endangered by neo-Nazism. Under those circumstances, the actions that President Putin take were correct. I'm talking about a much longer-term situation where we can deal with the decisions of those nations, whether they want to be part of the Russian Federation, which there are strong indications that in those areas a majority are, or whether they want to be part of an independent nation or part of the Ukraine. But all of this can only be dealt with in a context where the threat of the continuing encroachment of NATO has to be brought to an end. And the line that President Putin had drawn to say thus far and no further and that certainly he will not allow NATO to now also be a part of Ukraine is an acceptable position. That was the arrangement that was originally made when we talked about the kind of geopolitical developments that happened in Eastern Europe. There were undertakings given to President Putin that NATO will not expand.
Eastward.
Those undertakings are clear. I have watched several interviews where President Putin sits with the documents that had been agreed on. But all of those documents have been breached by NATO and also by some of the nations such as Poland and also by the Ukraine. The current Ukrainian president has committed contractual breach over and over and over again, and he did so with the empowerment and support of Joe Biden and of the United States of America.
So you reckon this might lead to World War III?
I hope not.
Or a nuclear warfare?
I believe that President Putin is a strong but also a responsible leader. I hope that we will not get to World War III, but that we will get to a point where the balances of power change so significantly in the world that we can have a more multilateral world.
So you push for de-dollarization as well?
And also for the de-dollarization, absolutely. The dollar is the worst dominant factor in the exploitation of the majority of the people in the world. And the moves that have been made by President Putin, by also China, and also the support that has now been given by many countries that have joined BRICS are critical for the de-dollarization, for a multilateral power dynamic in the world, which will empower the vast majority of the people in the world and give us the opportunity to be able to stand up against this unilateral, bilateral power dynamic that we have inherited over so many decades and have been a leftover of the Cold War that was, according to Ronald Reagan in the United States, lost by the East and by the developing nations.
Yes.
What we see now is a reassertion of the power of those that the United States have been trampling on and have been intimidating by their military power.
How long can Ukraine go? Because they're giving them more funding. Americans are funding them and the West is behind them.
Obviously, the war that Ukraine is fighting against the special military operation of the Russian Federation is artificially maintained by funding from Western Europe and by the United States of America. So the real military operation that the Russian Federation is at the moment carrying out is not so much even against Ukraine, but it is against the financial, artificial continuing of that war by the United States of America especially, but also by the Western European Union.
Last but not least, Mr. Niehaus, are you optimistic about South Africa?
I love my country.
Yes.
I'm deeply disappointed by what came about now in this farcical grand coalition, which calls itself totally wrongly a government of national unity. I hope that we can see this GNU, this animal, which is called GNU, falling apart as quickly as possible. I believe that the elections on the 29th of May actually showed us a very important move to the left. It was a progressive move. It was an important situation that the ANC for the first time lost its overall majority. That is the most significant takeaway from that election. What has happened is that, unfortunately, the reactionary powers in South Africa have managed to cause an aberration to that election, because the coalition of the right and of the racist supremacists that have been cobbled together under the support, sadly so, of a former liberation movement, the African National Congress, has led now to a government which is not reflecting what actually happened in the vote of the elections of the 29th of May. So for us, as those who have been supported by a large part of the population of South Africa on the progressive left,
yes,
it is our duty now to continue to increase the pressure on this aberration called GNU, up to the point where eventually it will collapse. And so, I believe that once that happens, and hopefully that will happen,
the markets won't respond well
quicker
to that.
rather than later. And we mustn't allow ourselves to be intimidated by markets, because it's part of the monopoly capitalist propaganda to always frighten us. We must stop that.
The rand will strengthen.
The quicker we can get rid of this government of national unity and bring together progressive forces in the economic freedom fighters, the MK party, ATM, those progressive parties in South Africa, and we can work, if the ANC is prepared to work with us, we can work with the ANC. But we can do so only under circumstances where there's no participation of right-wing supremacists, new liberals, and those who are the Oppenheimer parties, as we've called them. Then we can form a progressive government. And that option remains on the table. At any time when this coalition collapses, that option remains on the table. And the EFF, through our Secretary General, Commissar Marshal Dlamini, had written a very important letter to the ANC just before that terrible Sunday when Ramaphosa announced his GNU oversized, overbloated cabinet.
The bloated one.
On that Friday night, we issued that letter, which stated we are prepared to work for a progressive and truly democratic and truly economic liberatory coalition in South Africa. We stated our conditions, which were not based on hunting for positions, but it was based on principle of ideology. That letter is there for the record. It is an important letter, which I hope when this GNU eventually collapses, we will be able to take out again and come back to the principles that are so clearly extrapolated in that important document.
Mr. Niehaus, I'd like to ask you a personal question. And you've been in the struggle, you've suffered greatly. Do you think it was all worth it?
Absolutely.
Because even, for example, you have a whole lot of, in your community, in the Afrikaner community, that will call you names. Does it hurt you? Do you think this was all worth it? That is
Look, one is a human being. And as a human being, you do get hurt by insults. But I've learned over the years to grow a thick skin about those insults, because I know that they come from a bad place. I know that they come from racism and white supremacism, and I will reject it with the contempt that such behavior deserves. My whole commitment to the liberation struggle has always been full, not just democratic empowerment, but full economic liberation for the people of South Africa. I do not regret for a moment having taken the stances that I've taken. I knew when I took those stances that my mainly white Afrikaans community would reject me, and they did so. I understood the consequences of what that could hold for me. When I decided to join the ANC in 1979, I knew that there's probably only two options for me. Either I will die in the struggle or I will go to prison. Yeah. I was fortunate that I ended with the second option. I went to prison for almost 10 years. I'm glad that I was given an opportunity to come out of prison and to continue with the struggle. For me, one of the saddest chapters in my life was what the ANC did to our liberation ideals. And personally also how the ANC treated me. They treated me with disdain. When I opposed the selling out that they were getting involved in, I was not just called names, but I was fired from my job. They went out of their way to prevent me from getting any employment for years.
Oh, yes.
It was their intention to destroy me emotionally, but also financially. I'm hugely grateful that despite all of that, and despite the deep hurt and the deep disappointment that I feel about the conduct of the ANC and members of the African National Congress who at certain stages in my life I held in high regard. Despite that, I'm deeply grateful that I can sit here in front of you today, having been given another opportunity by a truly progressive, economic emancipatory party, the Economic Freedom Fighters, to serve again in the National Assembly. I've come back after the first time that I served in the National Assembly 26 years ago. I'm back now again.
You're back.
I'm going to continue with the struggle. I will not back off. I will not change any of my ideals, those same ideals with which I joined the liberation struggle 45 years ago in 1979. For me, it is simply a luta continua.
A luta continua.
But one thing, and I must say this.
Yes.
Any of my comrades and former comrades in the African National Congress who sell out must not expect sympathy from me. They mustn't come and tell me I've got no other option. I have to stay in the ANC. I have to vote for sell-out actions. As Supremo Mupelu did when he voted for the impeachment of Advocate Busisiwe Mkhwebane, as Bongani Bongo did when he voted for the impeachment of Mr. Justice John Slope. Those were people that I called my comrades. They are no longer.
They're no longer. No.
My comrades. They are sellouts. And I will call them out as such.
Do you still greet them?
Because ultimately, that's not even relevant. If I greet them or not, they are sellouts. Because ultimately, I know that all the reasons that they advance, why they do what they do, could also have been reasons why I could have sold out. I could also have said, but what about my job? I could also have said, but my child is 7 years old and I need to pay the school fees.
The rent.
I need to pay my rent.
Yeah, it's like...
But I made a decision that I'm prepared to sacrifice everything for my ideals. And by that norm, I live. By that norm, I judge anyone else, including Supremo Mupelu and Bongani Bongo and Cyril Ramaphosa and anyone else. There can be no middle ground. We are now in a struggle where the line is drawn. You're either for us or you're against us.
You were also mentored by Reverend Bear Snowdea. Yes. Can you just tell us about him? He's one of great men.
Well,
Wambay, as they call it.
Wambay was my father when my father could not be a father to me. I was expelled from the Rand Afrikaans University at a very tender age of 18 because I was opposed to apartheid and because I said that the racist policies of the university only having white students was unacceptable. I then ended up, because my dad was very angry that I got expelled, also thrown out of the house. And for a period of time, I was literally living on the streets without anywhere to go. Until I met Wambay. And in Wambay, I found someone who understood me as a young Afrikaner, because he himself was an Afrikaner. He understood how vicious Afrikaners can be when they disagree with you.
They disagree.
And Wambay became my mentor. He is the one who helped me to work through my Afrikaner history and background. He is the one who introduced me to the ANC and to the Umkhonto we Sizwe. Many people don't know it, but Wambay was an active member of the ANC, and he was an active participant in the armed struggle. So Wambay was the person which I could use as my sounding board, as my ethical and moral person to engage in. He was the one who helped me to understand the struggle, but he was also the one who taught me how you cannot compromise on your most basic principles and ideals. When Wambay was very ill, in his last days when he was lying in the old age home in Johannesburg, and President Nelson Mandela came to visit him. Wambay, emaciated as he was pulling himself up from the pillows, and he said, "Nelson, stop selling out." And he was talking about those negotiations that you and I spoke about earlier. So the last words, and there was a long relationship and friendship between President Mandela and Wambay. But the last words that Wambay shared a couple of days before he passed on with Nelson Mandela was, "Nelson, stop selling out."
Sure. Profound.
And I think we can conclude on that note.
Yes.
And today we say to the ANC, to Cyril Ramaphosa, to Supramo Mupelu, to Bongani Bongo, even to Lekute Dakota, stop selling out. We are not going to play marbles with power. We will not tolerate what you are doing now. We will take you on. We will eventually defeat you. We will keep your feet to the flames of the hopes of the people of this nation.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Viva Karl Niehaus, viva!